The locals is a slang term in English that refers to people in a town like the fictional town of Howland, a summer town or a vacation town. I mean, I'm sure they have such towns in France as well, where there's a summer population or a kind of tourist population, people who are there part of the time, usually from the city, and they come and enjoy the surroundings and spend money. But then there are the people who live in that same town year-round, through the winter, usually more of a working class population, and in American parlance, those are referred to as the locals. You know, epigraphs, usually I don't like epigraphs, other writers' epigraphs, because I feel like it's a cheap way of giving a kind of classical veneer. You know, you write a novel about contemporary life, but you give it an epigraph from Aristotle, and then it seems very serious. I'm very suspicious of that. But in this case, the novel begins with 9/11, and by the time it's over, at least in my mind, one of the things that's happened is that Americans themselves have internalized the compulsion to blow it up, so to speak, to destroy it. And this comes out in our contemporary politics in America in extraordinary ways. And in the Tea Party movement in America, I don't know if French people will be familiar with that, but a very conservative populist movement that is all about dismantling the government and focusing on individual responsibility. So when I read that quote, it seemed extraordinary to me, the language of it. I thought, you know, this is a governor of an American state. I thought, can you not hear yourself? Can you not hear what you're saying? And the reason I didn't put his name on it is just because it felt to me more interesting as a kind of voice of the people rather than being assigned to this one particular politician who's assigned to a particular party, and I didn't want it to seem like that was my point. I had to attribute it to some place, but no, I like what you say about the novel being a kind of contemporary chronicle of its own. At least it is for me. I mean, I know that many great writers have the desire to write about the future or the past or some kind of alternate reality. But for me, it's always been, you know, a very specific way of thinking about now. And I mean, it's a little bit of a larger now than a newspaper deals with, because, you know, this is already, it's hard for me to believe that the events I'm writing about in this book are already almost 20 years old, but still, it's, historically speaking, it's the now, and an effort to kind of come to terms with it or make some sense of what's happening. So. Well, first of all, yeah, it's the other towns referred to in the novel, the towns around Howland, are real places. And I know those places pretty well because, for one thing, that's quite near where I grew up. So that area of southwestern Massachusetts. It's as if I always thought, you know, if the map were made of rubber and you stretched it so a little space appeared, could kind of drop Howland in there. So it has, you know, the attributes of a number of the towns around it, but it's an imaginary place. And yes, the name Howland, I thought of you know, the making it into a compound word like that, Howland. But also I had in mind Allen Ginsberg's Howl. Yeah. Both reasons, really. The practical reason being that it's a place that I know reasonably well. I mean, there are little vacation communities like that all over the country, so in that sense I could have said it anywhere. But that's a place that I know, but also it's true that if you feel that you're writing a book about America and American democracy, you know, Massachusetts is the cradle of that, so you get a certain, you know, mythic resonance there that you wouldn't if the book were in Kansas or Arizona or someplace like that. At one point, I even went so far as to I was choosing the characters' last names from the manifest. I don't know if you know that word, the list of passengers on the Mayflower. but I couldn't. It didn't work. I had to give it up. Yes, I mean it's. I don't want to. It is possible to put too much importance on 9/11. I mean, I think a lot of the things, a lot of the sources of the current climate of American populist anger, they were there already. But in an American context, certainly 9/11 was the beginning of something, and we didn't realize at the time what it was the beginning of, which is basically a long, intense political reaction. So it was important to me to try to begin the novel there or around there, but it's also very hard to write good. It's hard to make good art about 9/11. I usually, when other writers or filmmakers try it, I usually don't have a good response, but that's part of the reason why I chose this very eccentric view of events from a sort of underground man living in the city. Yeah, just very much. An extraordinary change, I think, in a relatively short time in the city. As you say, we only see it briefly in the city, but it has gone. It's reverted, I think, to what it was before. That's another characteristic, I think, of not just 9/11, but of tragedy in general, especially a kind of common tragedies, that we think that it changes us forever, but in fact, as Mark's wife says at one point, it's we overestimate that in fact the power of who you are, the power of the everyday, is not to be underestimated. Although I wasn't really thinking, as far as the end of the book, it does take place after the financial crash, but the book sort of skips over it in a way, because honestly you would have had to write another 100 pages to talk about that. But the ending that I had in mind is slightly different, because if I thought of it as a book about the early years of this American century, then it's bracketed on one end by 9/11, and on the other end, without giving too much away about that last chapter, to me what it represents is a kind of homegrown miniature, one-person version of Occupy Wall Street. And if you do the chronological math in the book, that last scene takes place, I think, just a few weeks before the beginning of the real Occupy. So I don't, just as I don't want to put too much, invest 9/11 itself with too much power, I don't want to invest Occupy with too much power either, not at all. In fact, I'm skeptical of it in a lot of ways, but it seemed to me like a good bookend to what went on in that century, and also a somewhat hopeful one in the figure of Haley. Who is maybe not that politically sophisticated, but she's also 17 years old, and she's just waking up. Yes, it's always a challenge. I mean, I guess particularly in this book, it's always a challenge to balance the handling of time. On the one hand, you want your reader to feel oriented. On the other hand, and probably more importantly, you want it to reflect real lived experience. And one of the fundamentals of that lived experience is that some days are very important and specific, but other types, especially in a small town, I would think, it's a bit more of a cycle. It's a bit more about repetition than progress, and it should feel like that. So I tried to put little signposts in the book. Right. Those are in the background, and you hear the echoes of them. But I guess it does. You do have to put a bit of trust in the reader to write that way. I put an enormous amount of trust in the reader to know that the financial collapse happened. I think it would be a pretty. Some parts of the book might be confusing if you didn't know that. Well, it's not that it's too simple, it's that it gives me too much credit. I started writing the novel in 2013, and I'd love to be able to say, I saw it all coming, but I did not see it all coming. it's hard not to read it now as being a kind of allegory of the Trump era, and I suppose that's fair enough. Even though Hattie is in important ways very different from Trump. I think at one point someone was asking me to describe the difference between them, and I said that probably Hattie and Trump went to a lot of the same parties in New York, but Hattie would just leave when Trump showed up. He couldn't stand to be in the room with him. But the phenomenon, and I don't know how strictly American this is, I don't know if this exists in Europe or elsewhere to the same degree, but especially American, working class people invest a lot of authority, moral authority, and also practical authority in businessmen, and especially in very, very rich people. And this is a phenomenon that existed before Trump, that Trump is simply a part of. I lived in New York City during all of the Mike Bloomberg years, for instance, when Bloomberg, who is one of the richest men in the world, decided he wanted to become the mayor of New York. And it's hard to describe, but people think if you're a rich person, there might be something suspicious about that. But if you're a really, really rich person, then you have some kind of power that's not only intellectual but also moral. And part of it has to do with the idea that if you're really rich, you can't be bought. Somehow you're incorruptible. This is a very stubborn idea in American political life, and I stubborn enough that I wanted to write about it before the awful ascension of Trump. And Mark, a lot of what people might read, especially non-American readers, might read as Mark's flaws, a kind of over-ambition, an obsession with money, a worship of the rich. Those are pretty classically American virtues, especially the idea that you are supposed to want to better yourself. You're supposed to feel some kind of dissatisfaction and want to climb the economic and social ladder. And Mark has internalized that idea, to his peril. I think a lot about form, but I think probably most of all about the beginnings of all my novels and how to do them and how to construct them in a way that is functional but also unfamiliar. That's not. There were a couple of inspirations for doing it this way. One of them, as a teacher of Flaubert, you may know, what's another novel with a great disappearing first-person narrator. Yeah, so I had Madame Bovary very much in mind there. Also, this will sound odd, especially in conjunction with Madame Bovary, but have you seen the Stanley Kubrick film 2001?
Yeah.
Do you remember how it begins?
Mm-hmm.
So that in the early days of my writing the book, when I was working on this beginning, the name of the computer file that I kept it was called the Ape Scene, because I was trying to write a prologue that was a prologue in the same purely thematic way as the prologue of 2001. I liked the idea that it seemed like it was introducing the story, and in fact it is, but not in the way you thought.
Yeah.
That it introduces us to Mark, but gives us a kind of outside view of Mark, so that we see how he looks to others before we see how he looks to himself. And I liked that idea of a prologue that turns out to be a prologue in theme only. Although there is that connection to Mark, where Mark leaves the city and we follow him. It'll sound perverse, but I liked writing in that voice, but I certainly could never write in that voice for a whole book. That'd be too much for the reader, too much for me, that first person voice. Yeah, I like that reading of it very much. Yeah, as I said before, it's hard to write about 9/11 period, and so I liked the idea of a strange skeptic's view of it. What's objectionable about most 9/11 related art is not only how sentimental it is, but how much it takes for granted certain sentimental tropes about the event and how everyone felt about it and what happened and all that. So I like the idea of beginning with it, but beginning with it in a way that offered a take on it that seemed almost comically off kilter. But also, frankly, I like the idea that in some respects, that unnamed narrator kind of turns out to be right. That people are faking it a little bit, and that his somewhat cynical view of the way people really are. You could argue that he's not totally wrong. Every reference you make is very flattering to me of the Altman and Eliot and Flaubert and Stendhal. I did have in mind. I was thinking about Middlemarch overall because to me one of the great pleasures and amazements of Middlemarch is you're hundreds of pages into it before something happens that makes you realize that even in this small patch of ground, some of these major characters who are living right next to each other don't know each other, and that's not for reasons of geography, obviously, but for reasons of class and social construct. So I wanted to keep the book in a similarly small patch of ground, but have it be a very wide array of voices, characters, etc. I think there's one chapter of the book. It's the third one, although it's numbered 2 because of the 0. And that one specifically, I set out to write with no space breaks, so that all of the point of view transitions have to be accomplished some other way. And really, the reasons for that were, sometimes I just like to do things because they're hard. I mean, because I think it's a challenge. So there was that, but there was also, I think, the idea that in a small town in particular, you're too close to other people. Yeah. That paradoxically in the city it's very easy to be private, but in a small town everybody knows your business maybe more than you'd like them to, and so I wanted it to feel cramped in that way. But again, I felt like that was a decision that wouldn't be fruitful for the whole book, but for that one 90 or so page sequence. I tried to accomplish figure out how to accomplish those point of view shifts without interrupting the action. I guess I would say it would be a very good definition of the kind of fiction I write, and other people. I can't say that's true across the board. But for me, that's one of the things that not only the novel does, but that it does better than other forms. Really, is to be able to toggle back and forth between the interior and the social, and to explore the ways that those influence each other, sometimes unconsciously. Right.
And a novel is a way to take a distance.
Yes, and a way to look critically at some of those foundational ideas and received ideas. It's important, I think, to try not to condescend, especially to fictional figures, because I don't think that Mark's really. I feel sorry for Mark and his ideas are not really about greed per se, but as you say, they're ideas that he was invested with as an American, as a young American. These are things that he has internalized from a culture and from a history that's far greater than he is. Somebody was mentioning the other day that he's a kind of cousin to Adam Morey from The Privileges, who also was formed by the idea that you're supposed to better yourself, you're supposed to want more. That's you have to keep moving forward or die. That's the American way. If I remember that passage that you're mentioning, Mark has kind of a moment where I think he's drinking while this happens, and he has a moment where he thinks like maybe the American idea, maybe it explains you, or maybe you just use it to explain yourself, and there you have exactly what you were talking about, the interplay between the private and the social. The American sense that things would get better for you, that your children would be better off than you are, etc. That I mean, at least from an economic perspective, that was true for a long time. It's not so true anymore, and that is the source of a lot, at least in the U.S., of a lot of the populist anger and resentment and xenophobia and racism, and the idea that people, if I don't have this thing I was promised, it must be because someone has taken it from me. And what happens there, and this is not an American phenomenon. This is centuries old, really. But when a populace becomes disenchanted in that way with institutions or with politics, they will look for one strong figure in which to replace that faith, and voila, fascism. So you could. It would be going too far, I think, to say that Holland turns into a kind of fascist state, but there's a little bit of that. Yeah. Yes, and in this moment, in this historical moment, I think maybe the genesis of the whole thing for me was wanting to try to find a way to ask myself the question, how did we get from there to here in such a short time? There being the sense of overwhelming fellow feeling and patriotism and compassion, etc., that followed 9/11, from in less than a decade to the mainstreaming of what were previously radical ideas about dismantling the state. I just thought that's a strange journey in such a short time, and so I wanted to find out how about American identity and American feeling in this particular moment. Yes, I mean not entirely, but in very large part. Yes. Jerry was ahead of his time in a way, because that's really the mainstream idea now in America, is that among the white male population in particular, it's not only that they feel under attack, but that while they're in their own view, while they're under attack, they're also being told that they're the oppressors. And so Jerry has his moment early in the book where he's lost his job, he has no money, no wife, no family, really, he has nothing, and yet he's being told that he's a kind of bastion of privilege, and that enrages him. That's unfortunately an idea with a lot of currency in American life today. Yes, I guess the only reason I hesitate is that as you say, different characters have very different ideas of what equality and justice might consist of. But justice in particular, that Jerry feels that there are great injustices all around him, and again, as with that narrator of the prologue, Jerry's an extreme and alienating character, but he's also not always wrong. Occasionally I feel like he'll say something in one of his long blog rants that I might actually agree with, very occasionally. So he's concerned with the justice, and Haley, as you say, is that's exactly right, that she has like the kind of political awakening that a teenager has, frankly, which is just, I don't know what to do, but I know that this is wrong, and that's as far as she gets. Yes, I agree, and one of the reasons why it was important to me to set the novel in a rural place outside the city is that the things that particularly white men in our culture are taught to think of as their enemies, immigration, the federal government, etc. Those things are they're mostly invisible in small town life. There really aren't a lot of people of color in Howland. I mean, in fact, there really aren't any. But the fact that that's true allows you to speculate and allows you to project onto those phenomena even more fear, even more paranoia. So yeah, speculation of that kind, as well as financial speculation, definitely. And then even in a more modest kind of way, one of the questions that I felt like was like a bell that was rung occasionally throughout the book is, what is a house? Because there are many, many different definitions in the book of what constitutes a house or a home. Yes, although I had to remind myself, I mean, internet history, so to speak, moves so fast that I really had to make an effort to remind myself, when Jerry is writing his blog in 2002 or 3, how long ago that was, and that things were different then. So he's really just he's almost at the dawn of it.
Of course.
But yes, it changes everything. The type of speech that the internet allows. More so than facing a camera, where I think you're conscious when you're facing a camera that you're speaking to the public. I think when you're alone in your room typing for the internet, you know that you're speaking to somebody, but really primarily you're speaking to yourself. So I wanted to find a way to write about the specificity of that. And TV is exactly what I was talking about before. It's the ultimate tool of the idea that the object of your fear is out there somewhere, but you can't see it, and we'll show it to you, but that's it's still just an image. But the image for Mark's parents, for instance, the image and the reality just become the same thing. That is, if you see something on Fox News, it's as present in your life as if it were outside your window. At the end of the book, the things in Howland that have been blown up, which are its institutions, the character of its communal life and its history. Those are all things. I mean, I don't want to. It sounds too simple when I say it, but the central irony is that those things, which were supposedly under attack, in the end, the people of Howland needed no help blowing those things up. They blew it up themselves. I think it's this was mostly just for me in writing the book, but for me, each of the chapters has some little formal thing that's individual to it. I mean, like we talked about in the chapter that has no space breaks. And so I think it's really mostly, if not all, one long chapter of the book that has all these things in it, that has the directly quoted news. The blog, I think, appears multiple times, but the other voices, the newspaper, the town minutes, and I wasn't really thinking at the time about the novel in contrast to those, but I was thinking about them as other voices, institutional voices, other ways of telling the story. The police blotter is another one. I don't know if there is such a thing as the police blotter in France, but in small town papers especially, kind of at the end, you'll see like who got arrested that week for what. And those things tell the story too, but each of them tells the story a little bit falsely. And I think the idea that these other storytelling methods, these official narratives, are unreliable, that too contributes to the anger within the book. And I guess if you want to, it would seem like I'm flattering myself to say, like, but in contrast to the novel, which always tells the truth. But I guess you're right. I think I mean, it's not going too far to say that one of the reasons novels are still worth writing is as a counter narrative, as a counter narrative to the official ways of telling the story of what's happening to us. Well, I mean, I guess I would agree with that. I mean, how many? I've only written 7 books, and Balzac wrote, 100.
More than many French people, but
Yeah, but I would agree with it. But I'm not conscious of it when I'm working or when I start a new book. At least I make an effort not to be conscious of it, because I think you can, especially when you've developed a body of work. You do notice that certain themes persist or recur, but it's possible to be too self-conscious about that in your work. So I know that, but I'm in a constant process of trying to forget it. Right. Well, it's funny because actually that word in America certainly has come to mean something different than it did when I wrote The Privileges. I think that's been now the idea. Privileges become a kind of cultural. I don't know. You know the phrase buzzword. Buzzword is something that's very kind of common slang. Very much in the news. And it's more cultural now. It's more about race and gender and things like that, and less concretely about having the right to do something that other people don't have the right to do. So I mean I knew I could hear that. I was aware of that when Penny said that. A lot has happened to that word, at least in American discourse in the last 15 years.